Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and so much unknown really about what's going on there. I'm surprised by how little it's discussed in the press, and Mexico is just out of the picture for some reason, and it's so important. So I'm delighted that we can have a real good discussion on Mexico today.
You're 100% correct because the most important country for the U.S. is Mexico by far. It's not even close.
And Trump's not talking about it, and the press is not talking about it. It's as if nobody wants to talk about Mexico. And as you
Well,
say, it really is the key country. So I hope we'll get some some clarity
clarity.
on this today. But I think what's much more important is direct investment. And I don't have a good view on that. And my impression is that it's falling as companies need more clarity before they do anything. And hopefully we can get a good vision on that.
Let's see. Damian, welcome.
How are you?
Oh, well, thanks. Good to
Great to
have
see you,
you.
Damian. It's been a long time.
Been a very long time, Jean.
Damian, listen, thank you very much. What we normally do is I'm going to give you an embarrassing intro, and then we're just going to go to it, if you don't mind. So for the viewers who don't know Damian, Damian is the founder and CEO of Miranda Partners. Miranda is a Mexico City-based advisory firm that helps both public and private companies in a lot of things: media, IR, finance, research, ESG, PR. Damian, I think you do it all down there in Mexico. Prior to Miranda, you had a long career in finance. That's how we know each other. Almost 20 years as country manager for UBS in Mexico. Jean and I were clients, and we enjoyed your invitation-only conferences down there at UBS. So thank you for that. Uh, Before joining UBS, you had stints at some investment banking boutiques focused on emerging markets, Caspian and Barings, where you and I were colleagues for a cup of coffee, but we were colleagues for a while. And you got your start in journalism. Obviously, everyone knows you as the representative of the FT in Mexico. And you have degrees at both Oxford and Harvard. And I hope I didn't embarrass you too much. But just to begin with the big picture, Damian, before we get to the economy and markets, obviously everything's about geopolitics. What's your assessment, just to get things started, what's your assessment of President Scheinbaum and how she's handled Trump 2.0? And let's start with there.
Sure. I think that Scheinbaum, she's been in power now for just over a year. She came to power on the 1st of October. And she's managed Trump, surprisingly well, not an easy person to manage. I think they've had 14 phone calls over this year, and mainly addressing the key bilateral issues that Trump cares about, which is drugs, especially fentanyl, immigration, and USMCA and trade imbalances, if you want to put it there. Those are the three kind of main issues. Obviously, some other issues I'm sure have come up. And so far on immigration, Trump is very happy with the outcome, and Rubio, the Secretary of State, Mark Rubio, said so. Immigration has basically come to a standstill. There's almost no net illegal immigration into the United States at this point. Most of the net migration was through Mexico, but not Mexicans, right? Mostly it was Central Americans, Venezuelans, and Chinese and Africans, and you name it, were coming through Mexico. That's been blocked. In addition, obviously, Mexican migration has also come to stop us to a large extent as well. So she's done a good job in helping deliver that. Although U.S. policies, especially on asylum, have been perhaps the main drivers. But Mexico has blocked convoys from coming from Guatemala and cooperated with the U.S. in effectively closing the border to illegal or undocumented migration. On drug smuggling, she's done a pretty good job. She's sent, I think it's 52 leading cartel members that were in jail in Mexico to the United States. basically ignoring, the extradition kind of due process that they could have insisted on, but saying that coming up with a legal kind of loophole to allow them to be sent to the US. US, happy to get them. I guess they could get a lot of information from them now that they're in US custody. Also, a lot of them were basically operating the cartels from Mexican jails, so they won't be able to do that in the US. So that will impact their activities and ability to send drugs. And obviously, they're being replaced by other people, have been replaced, but that's a good thing. And fentanyl seems to have declined based on seizures at the border. So we're pretty happy with that. Trade is what obviously Sheinbaum wants to get in return, which is the continuity of the USMCA in one form or another. Mexico's effective average tariff rate that it's paying on the US, is probably around 3 or 4%, and that's maybe half what most European countries are paying now on average. So Mexico, even though there's these 25% tariffs on auto parts and tariffs on steel and aluminium, there's a bunch of sort of exceptions to USMCA free trade that Trump has effectively imposed, citing for the most part national security reasons. Overall, most Mexican trade, 85%, is entering the US tariff-free, and the other 20% is paying a higher tariff, but that gives you this kind of effective tariff rate that's higher than it was, but still lower than the rest of the world is facing. So I think on those three fronts, Sheinbaum has done a reasonably good job, and she's achieved that without in any way undermining her own popularity within Mexico, because you could argue, as you're seeing a little bit in Argentina right now, that by kind of carrying too much favor with Trump, that could hurt her domestically. But her popularity ratings, approval ratings are very high, even higher than AMLO's were after 1 year in office, depending on what sort of opinion polls you look at. But she's in the 70s or in the 80s, and people, generally speaking, based on the polls and anecdotal sort of tidbits that you hear and talk to people about, people are very complimentary on the way she's handled Trump. Sometimes I think her cleverest thing was never to have met Trump. So quite incredible. It's been a year and a month now, and there was going to be a meeting in Canada, but Trump flew back early, so they didn't actually meet. But she obviously could have called up and said, "I'll go and visit you," and there would have been a big show around that. But I think after seeing what happened with Zelensky when he went from Ukraine, when he went to the White House and got humiliated very publicly, I think she probably thought, let's stay in Mexico and do this by phone. I think it probably helps that she's a woman. I think Trump maybe treats women, not in every case, in the public sphere, with a bit more courtesy, perhaps, than he treats men. You're American, let me know what you think about that. And then it probably helps that she's a very controlled, very disciplined, very thoughtful. Some people, in the past, sort of complained that she's sort of overly kind of icy and unemotional. But I think when it comes to Trump, someone who's got tremendous kind of self-control and discipline is probably the right approach to deal with him. So yeah, I think she's done well. Now we're only a year in. The USMCA kind of talks to potentially improve or modify the treaty are now just starting, and we don't know what's going to happen. It's probably going to happen next year, whether it's going to continue more or less as is, with a few exceptions on auto parts or heavy trucks, or whether Trump is going to try and break it up. I mean, it's a treaty, so it would have to go through the Senate, I guess, to do that, and then maybe not replace it at all, or replace it with bilateral treaties, because at one point when Carney was in Washington, there was talk about having 2 bilateral free trade agreements, which Mexicans and Canadians are not in favor of, because the relationship with the US is so asymmetrical as things are, that if they're just negotiating one-on-one with Trump, it's a lot more difficult to defend yourself than if you're together. So there's still a lot ahead, and the uncertainty of Trump, and the fact that at one point back in February he said Mexico was because of fentanyl, at the time that was his pretext. He said tariffs were going to be 25%. Peso took a massive hit, and then he sort of had this conversation on a Sunday, I think, with Sheinbaum, and he took it away. And that was before the Liberation Day tariffs, which came later on in April, of course. So that uncertainty and the unpredictability of Trump, and I guess you could say that the fundamental problem, which from Trump's perspective or Navarro perspective or Miller's perspective, that Mexico has a huge trade surplus with the United States, or in other words, the US has a big trade deficit with Mexico, is the elephant in the room, and the US, Trump doesn't like trade deficits, so Mexico is the biggest trade deficit, along with China, that the US has. So we're going to see what happens and how it gets renewed. In the meantime, this uncertainty, as I mentioned, has hampered investment in Mexico. So investment is down. Total investment is down, and a lot of people think that's because of USMCA uncertainty. Although I'm sure we'll get to this in a moment. There's also some domestic issues around the judicial reform and other things that are going on here that may also have affected investment negatively. Quite a long answer to your initial question, Tom.
Yeah, Damian, from the point of view here in the U.S., reading the press and watching TV and so forth, it's sort of striking that Mexico is not in the news almost at all. Is that a perception that you have in Mexico as well? Is that on purpose? Is that something that both Trump and Sheinbaum want, to keep a very low profile? But I do think it's very striking. I mean, it just doesn't appear. It's not on the agenda. Nobody talks about Mexico these days.
Yeah, I think every country, including Mexico, thinks it's more relevant to the US than it really is. So there's I'm sure Mexico thinks it's appearing more in the US than is actually the case, as you point out. And I'm sure the UK thinks it's more in the minds of the US than it really is. So secondly, I think that Sheinbaum does want to keep a low profile. She hasn't been to one thing she could do, to be in the press would be to go to Washington, right? And she hasn't been, clearly deliberately, and I think they think that they're better off negotiating, with the second level people and dealing with issues one by one than having a discussion in the media, where Trump is obviously very unpredictable and tends to kind of play out his maximalist negotiating strategy if it's very public, which is asking for a lot, in the hope of getting maybe half of that, which Mexico wants to avoid. And then, when Mexico's in the papers, in the US papers at least, or in US TV news and so on, it's usually bad stuff, right? It's usually drugs, or it's usually violence, or it's usually immigration. So I think, people aren't going to be putting sort of, the beauties of San Miguel Allende on the front page of a newspaper, right? So it's better not to be in the papers than be in the papers with bad stuff, right?
Damian, how is this affecting? We were talking before you got on about foreign direct investment, which is obviously always the key for these countries from a growth standpoint. I mean, we don't hear much, but is there do you see investment either not from the U.S. but from other countries? Are you seeing this activity amongst the business community getting investment from overseas?
Yeah, I mean there's different data sources on foreign direct investment. The Bank of Mexico, reports the most accurate numbers, the numbers that money that is actually coming into the country. Then there's Economy Ministry, the Secretaría de Economía, reports kind of official kind of registries of investments that companies plan to make. And then in the morning press conference of the president, the so-called mañanera, we get these like announcements all the time. From just last week, Salesforce said 1.3 billion. Walmart's talked about multiple billions in Mexico. They kind of throw these numbers out there in press conferences, which often don't correspond to what they're actually going to do, or the time frame is very long, so the annual investment's not too big. So, and then the issue with the central bank numbers is a lot of the foreign investment is actually reinvestment. So the foreign company, let's say BBVA or Walmart, which is the biggest retailer here, as you know, has a lot of profits, and then they invest those profits. That counts as kind of foreign investment. But 80 to 90% of the foreign direct investment is actually reinvested profits. It's not money coming in. So it's sometimes kind of difficult to make sense of all the numbers, which is why I like to look at just gross fixed investment, which includes foreign and domestic investment, because that's what matters to GDP. And that is down, roughly speaking, from January to July, which I think is the last data point. It's down 7% versus January to July last year. So investment has taken a big hit. The Mexican economy is, likely to grow at about 1% this year, let's say. So it's below population growth, and the economy hasn't been growing. And the main explanation for that is lackluster investment. And as we mentioned, that's probably related to USMCA uncertainty, and also maybe related to some of the domestic policy reforms that this nationalist government has championed. The numbers are probably not going to look too good over the next few months, because you've got Citi, which is obviously a foreign company, disinvesting or selling its stake in Banamex to a Mexican. So that would be negative foreign investment. The total amount is about $9 billion. The first 25% has already been announced to Chico Pardo, big Mexican billionaire, the owner of the Cancun Airport Group, Azur. He's paying 2.3 billion, so that's Mexican money replacing foreign money. You also have last year Iberdrola, the Spanish electricity utility or energy utility, selling to a Mexican vehicle, MIP, Mexico Infrastructure Partners, helped by Mexican development banks. I think that was $6 billion. So you're seeing some very sizable disinvestments by foreign companies that are kind of slightly clouding the overall numbers, which is and they're always like, and I did the same thing when I was working in an investment bank. You say, well, adjusting for this or excluding these one-off factors, right? Usually when it's the other way around, you don't adjust, So, well, foreign investment is doing really well because Citi's just bought Banamex. So I think the numbers without adjustments on foreign investment probably not going to look too good, especially if you exclude reinvestment of profits.
On this subject, what's changed with regards to Chinese investments in Mexico since Trump has come in?
Yeah, I haven't seen great data on Chinese investment. Trump, I guess, effectively came in obviously in January. It might be too early. Now, what Mexico has done is to slap tariffs, additional tariffs on Chinese goods, right? So they've announced a month ago that next year tariffs, depending on what the product is, are going to go from 20 to as high as 50% on Chinese goods. So Mexico has been running a massive trade deficit with China. So the numbers are pretty startling. Mexico imported last year about $120 billion of Chinese goods and only exported $10 billion to China. So it had a trade deficit with China of $110 billion. But what's striking about it is not just the number, but the imports are basically 10 times Mexican exports to China. So it's just a huge gap. So and to some extent, that Mexico then has its trade surplus with the US, which is bigger than that. The deficit with China is reflected in the surplus of the US because some of those Chinese goods are going through Mexico to make their way to the US, either just smuggled through or more often than not, some small value added in Mexico. So Mexico's cracked down on these Chinese products, and one would expect that China will have to invest in Mexico rather than export to Mexico to avoid those tariffs. But they need to be able to. The problem they have is that because the rules of origin are quite tight, especially in the car sector, you need to have 70%, let's say, North American value added. But even if you put the factory in Mexico, if all your parts are coming from China, if you're integrated with your Chinese supply chains, you may not get to that 70%. So BYD, the car company, was going to put a plant in Mexico. It seems that that's been put on hold because I think they would have struggled to meet the rules of origin. And I also think Mexico didn't want to raise the ire of Trump at this particular moment. So Mexico just said, we don't want your investment right now. So Mexico is very nervous about how Trump would respond to big Chinese investment in Mexico. So is not being very responsive. So there's a big Chinese lithium company, maybe the largest in the world, called Ganfeng. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Mm-hmm.
They had a lithium mine in Mexico that's called Bacanora, Ganfeng Bacanora, in Sonora, the north of Mexico, more or less bordering with Arizona. And the AMLO, in his last year, penultimate year, effectively expropriated that mine, which Ganfeng was going to invest $400 million at least in developing it. It doesn't have any production right now. And the government passed a law that gives Pemex, or the Mexican state through Pemex, an exclusive rights over lithium. Now, what's happened since then? Absolutely nothing. So Mexico's government took over this lithium project. It's really just a project with potential, allegedly huge potential, and then did nothing with it. So Mexico was the big loser from that. They just blocked a big Chinese investment. What we don't know is if there was pressure, this was under Biden, but if there was pressure from the US to stop the Chinese having a big lithium mine close to the US border, or whether it was AMLO being a nationalist and thinking that he would get political support by sort of saying that Mexico, just like oil, has exclusive rights over lithium production. But it's an example of a big Chinese investment. Now, you still read, read about Chinese investment. And there's a really interesting report that was in Bloomberg, was highlighted in Bloomberg by Juan Pablo Spinetto, who's a Bloomberg Latin American columnist, citing a report by the Tec de Monterrey, the leading private university here, which is that Chinese investment in Mexico has actually been underreported by a factor of 10 over the last decade. So the reason for that, according to this academic study, which one of the authors works at the Bank of Mexico, so it's a very serious study, is that a lot of the Chinese investment is actually listed through entities in Singapore or even in Holland, which has an investment treaty with Mexico. So the Mayan train, one of the parts of the Mayan train, the train in the Yucatan, was built by a Chinese company, but they did that investment through a Netherlands entity, so it's counted as Dutch investment, but it's actually a Chinese controlled. I think it's called Chinese CCCC, the big Chinese construction company, and so they went. And what's really interesting about the Tech de Monterrey study is they went through hundreds of these investments that like were considered Chinese, and they said, guess what? They're actually not being categorized as Chinese. They're Dutch, they're American, they're Canadian. So Bacanora was done through Canada, actually. So that even technically, I mean, the investment didn't really pan out, as I mentioned. But if it had panned out, they did put in 100 million or so. That's would have been considered Canadian under the way the rules work. Scamfen has a Canadian business.
Going back to President Sheinbaum, before she got elected, people commented that her success would largely depend on her ability to distinguish herself from AMLO. Do you agree with that? And has she been able to create her own agenda and personality?
Yeah, I mean, I think her success depends on, like any politician's success, ultimately depends on delivering good results to the electorate, whether that's being separate or not separate to AMLO. It doesn't matter so much as long as she delivers results. But in order to deliver results, she clearly needs to pursue different policies in some areas than AMLO pursued, because AMLO's policies weren't working in those areas. So if she just followed what he did, like, for example, with the crackdown on the drug cartels, if she followed AMLO's policy, it wouldn't have delivered good results, almost certainly. Now, a lot of people thought she would be AMLO's puppet. I didn't ever think that, and she clearly isn't. And she said, when that was put to her, she said, people who think that, they don't know me and they don't know AMLO. And she's clearly calling the shots. In addition to that, there's a kind of fight within Morena, the political party that she represents, between the sort of more hardcore kind of AMLO lover sort of elements and the more kind of technocratic elements led by her, by Omar Gafouche as the security minister, by Edgar Amador as the finance minister, Luis Elena Gonzalez as the energy minister. So, you see this kind of, and to some extent, this has been characterized by her a fight on what's called huachico fiscal, which is the illegal importation of gasoline from the United States and selling that gasoline in Mexico without paying taxes, neither VAT nor what's called YEPS, which is a sort of a special duty on gasoline, so excise tax, I guess you'd say. And this flourished under AMLO. There was a massive increase under any numbers you care to look at of this gasoline smuggling, big boats coming to Mexico from Texas, full of gasoline, classified as something else, or just going across the border in trucks.
That trade is controlled by the drug gangs. Is that correct?
Some of it, but they've arrested some members of the Marines, nephews of the former minister, the former head of the Marines, the former admiral, and so it was a kind of collaboration between certain customs officials, drug cartels, members of the army or navy, maybe governors, maybe federal government officials. We don't know. We just know that the scale is so large. People talk about 30% of total gasoline consumption in Mexico was illegally smuggled. Also with U.S. criminals, a lot of this gasoline, most of this gasoline was taken from the U.S. and it's not illegal to buy the gasoline in the U.S. You can go to a refinery, I guess, and just buy it. But probably there are some illegal acts committed in the US, hiding the sources of your income, not filling in the right paperwork with respect to exporting it. So clearly there's individuals in the US, not necessarily authorities, and there've been arrests in the US related to this. So that's a big break. It was a huge fiscal drag for the government, mainly the government, also Pemex. Pemex lost sales, but the government lost VAT and they lost YEPS, the excise tax, which is the bulk of the tax arbitrage. So that's a clear example of where they've kind of differed in their approach. AMLO was either very laissez-faire with respect to this, or maybe in some form or another, if people close to him were linked to this. We don't know. Secondly, there have been some kind of allegations, unproven in some cases, of corruption unrelated to fuel smuggling of top Morena officials. The former Minister of Interior, Adán Augusto López, who not only was AMLO's Minister of Interior, which is a top political job here, but also was the governor of Tabasco, AMLO's home state. His security chief has been arrested for being a cartel leader, supporting a big cartel in Tabasco while he was the head of security. And then Adán Augusto himself has come under the spotlight for very significant income while he was in the government, for consulting activities, which is a little bit hard to understand how he was able to continue his consulting job while he was also working in the government. But anyway, and didn't seem to have paid a lot of income tax on it. And then AMLO's own son, who's got the same name as Andres Manuel López Obrador, but he's called Andy López Beltrán, has also been kind of exposed in the newspapers for taking a very extravagant holiday in Japan. There was a multi-$1,000 hotel bill, restaurant bill, shopping in fancy shops in Tokyo. So he's come under the spotlight a bit. So you've seen this kind of division in Morena between the kind of the old school Morena types and the Scheinbaum types, and that has put perhaps some additional distance between AMLO and Scheinbaum. But in her anniversary speech on October the 1st, her one-year anniversary speech, she only spoke positively about AMLO. So she never publicly criticized AMLO, and Adán Augusto remains the head of Morena faction in the Senate, so he's still a very important politician. No one has gone after him, and Andy, the son of Andres Manuel, is still the Secretary General of Morena. So there haven't been any specific repercussions related to these allegations.
Damian, we know that AMLO had at least we're told he had a dislike, let's just say a polite dislike for developers and real estate people in general. And talking to real estate people, through let's say over the last 25 years, there's always been this play of housing deficit, and you keep hearing that. I mean, I guess the question really is there a real big housing deficit still in Mexico? And is the government, let's say the Scheinbaum government, more favorable to allowing development of the building, residential housing, affordable residential housing in the northern parts of Mexico where it's needed? How's that working?
Yeah, I think AMLO was very suspicious, and often rightly so, of all the sort of intermediaries between government money and the final social good, in this case, social housing that was being built. So that there was a lot of corruption in this process. So he said, let's, simplifying it obviously, but he said, let's remove these intermediaries, intermediate them and give money to people, and then people with that money can build their own house with their own hands. And he also thought there was something, that showed sort of dignity of the Mexican worker building his own house, right? But obviously this whole infrastructure that was built around low-income housing, got decimated. Many of them got decimated by losing those subsidies and losing those permits and everything else that they got from the government. So it wasn't so much that it was against poor people having access to housing. He just wanted the money to go to them. But I think that there's also a political element. If you give people the money, they're much more grateful. They may not spend it on a house, maybe not their priority. Then if they get some house built for them at low cost in some place they don't really want to live, in part of some giant housing estate, some place with terrible public transportation infrastructure and so on. Now, so what did the developers do? Well, some of them, as we know, went bust or were bust, stayed bust. Others, Consorcio Ara or Vinte, kind of went up market to middle class houses where the financing for the most part isn't from the government but through private sector mortgages, bank mortgages, and so on. So now the government, the former head of Pemex, Oropesa, is now in charge of Infonavit, a housing financing entity in the public sector, and they are now building their own houses, not at huge scale, but before Infonavit gave credit to housing companies to build the houses, and now Infonavit itself is building houses. We'll see where that goes. There's not a good track record of the government executing its own infrastructure project. I think it's reasonable to be somewhat skeptical.
Yeah, I can imagine. Damian, Mexico's been sort of stuck in the middle income trap ever since the 1980 crisis, constantly growing below the average of emerging markets, and even, I think, below the U.S. growth rate over this period. So it's been 40 years sort of disappointing growth. It's been particularly bad, I think, over the past, during the AMLO years, and as you mentioned, continuing now for the next, I think, according to the IMF, if I remember the latest numbers, it's like 1% growth for the next 3 years in Mexico by the IMF projections. So what needs to be changed? What are the drivers? What must Mexico do to get to a more decent level of growth?
Yeah, I think growth, the drivers of growth for the most part are productivity improvements and capital deployment or investment. If you look at investment, investments low as a percentage of total GDP, and as I mentioned, declining. And their insecurity is obviously an issue. If you the judicial reform, but not just the judicial reform that AMLO proposed and Scheinbaum implemented, which basically replaced or will replace almost all of the judges with elected judges who are, for the most part, loyal to this government. But the judiciary was and the legal system was terrible beforehand anyway. So I don't think there was any doubt that Mexico needed a judicial reform. Just the one they put in place probably didn't correct for the real problems that existed. But the lack of legal clarity, the partisan judges, corruption is another kind of factor. And then tax collection, which is very low as a percentage of GDP in Mexico because 50% of the economy is informal, which isn't paying any tax. So Mexico's tax take to GDP is, depends how you add it up, it's about 25%. It's a lot lower than most other places. Means that the government doesn't have a lot of money to do its public investment. So, and the bank credit, as you all know, is low, and it's low because there isn't this secure rule of law, and because there isn't this appetite for investment, so companies don't ask for credit, and this lack of appetite for the reasons that I mentioned. So low credit is more a function of lack of investment more than the cause of it. But some people might argue that lack of competition in the banking sector has held the credit back. And then on the productivity side, it's very related to informality. So with 50% of the economy informal, not registered with the Social Security Institute, it means that they can't, if you're informal, you have this lovely tax arbitrage, not paying tax, so you're quite competitive. But you can't really scale your business, right? There's a point where being informal with more than, I don't know what the number is, 20 people, 30 people becomes impossible or too risky. So lack of formality is a big hindrance to productivity. And there was a great report a few years back by McKinsey, by someone who Tom knows, was the co-author, Thomas Lajou, called The Two Mexicos. He went from UBS to McKinsey, and he talked about the productivity growth in the formal sector versus productivity growth in the informal sector, kind of building on a lot of work that a very renowned Mexican economist who's based in Washington, Santiago Levy, had done, showing how the productivity gap was enormous, and not only was the gap enormous, but the growth rate in productivity. In addition to that, Mexico, these are the kind of longer term issues, but they have a very poor educational system, probably poorer than, worse than other countries with a similar level of income, let's say Chile or Colombia or Brazil. If you look at the PISA scores, which, as you know, is this OECD kind of global test, Mexico does way worse than it should do, looking at its GDP per capita. And why is educational poor in Mexico? I mean, there's clearly an educational capture by the unions that are more interested in preserving their, on average, and there's lots of exceptions to this, their sort of labor rights than on educating and teaching the students. Peña Nieto, who did many bad things as president of Mexico, did at least several good things, but one of the good things he did was try to change that. He took on the teachers union, and there was a big educational reform spearheaded by the then education minister Aurelio Nuño, and more or less the first thing AMLO did was when he won in part with the support from the teachers union, was to unwind that educational reform and return the system to the way it was. So not having a very educated people is obviously has an impact on productivity. So I think all of these factors explain the low growth. Now, notwithstanding the low growth, Morena won the 2024 election by a whopping 35 percentage points over the second place candidate, Xochitl Galvez. And so they're very popular. So what happened was that the income levels of the lower income people rose much faster than inflation. So there was a redistribution, which is obviously in a country with income as unequal as it is in Mexico, is very positive development. There was a redistribution of income to the less well-off and the people in the majority and the people that vote. So they were able to sustain and build on their electoral advantage. And in addition to that, they, I think, sincerely communicated very effectively that they were governing for the less well-off, which is the majority of the population. And even if they hadn't achieved that to the extent that some people might have wanted, that was their intention, whereas the previous governments had failed to communicate that that was their intention. They'd sort of communicated, whether deliberately or not, that they were governing for the better off. So there was a social message that was very appealing, somewhat reinforced by wage increases, but separate to the wage increases. About I'm on your side.
Has that higher income impacted beer sales, retail sales? Is it made a marked improvement?
Well, under AMLO, the consumption did well, especially of basic goods, because those are most sensitive to higher real incomes of the 60 or 70% of the population that are making less than $1,000 a month. And so, yeah, you saw very good results in basic kind of, whether it was bread or beer or Coca-Cola. Generally speaking, the numbers were quite positive.
So that's basically what Lula's trying to do in Brazil as well, right? It's the same kind of strategy, which produces low growth, but increases the consumers. So it's not all bad.
Now, the question is how sustainable it is. Because in the case of AMLO, he inherited a country with very low levels of public sector debt. So there was a lot of room to leverage up the economy. Now it's more difficult for Sheinbaum because she's inheriting, when AMLO left in his last year, the government deficit as a percentage of GDP, the government budget deficit went up to about 6%, which is not consistent with stable debt to GDP levels, not consistent with some grade ratings. So she's had to cut it down to about 4% of GDP, and that has led to a declining growth and actually consumption this year, 2025, even with the low income levels in Mexico, has been much weaker. So you've seen challenging numbers at OXXO, the big convenience store retailer, Walmart, and so on.
I guess we should wrap up soon, but I did want to ask you something that's on my mind a lot, which is this wave of immense technological change that the world is seeing. AI, electrification, electric vehicles, and so forth. How is Mexico dealing with that, and does that create opportunities, or it's more threats to growth?
I think Mexico's in a similar position to everyone else, which is they don't really know how this is going to unfold. On the negative side, Mexico has been a very effective kind of rust belt for the United States over the last 20 years under USMCA, producing cars, car parts, televisions, computers, and things like that. So if you get an army of robots like Elon Musk, I think his robot's called Optimus, building these cars, and robots building the robots, you might need less of this manual labor. And if on top of that you have Trump saying, if you don't do that, if you don't build in the United States with robots, I'm going to slap tariffs or taxes or whatever it is on you, then that could be harmful. Now the counter argument to that, and I had an equity strategist from Morgan Stanley, Nicolaj Lipman, on my own podcast called MexMoves, saying, well, Mexico could be producing these robots, because the US doesn't want China to produce. You don't want Chinese-made robots in every kind of village of the United States. It would be a threat to national security. So Mexico would be a great place to build these robots. So maybe Mexico, and then a lot of the kind of things that Mexico does are not so roboticizable and more manual labor. That it's going to take time to replace all these workers in a long time. The other issue that Mexico faces is that this AI transformation, AI obviously very related to robots because the robots will be driven by AI, it's very energy intensive. And you need, for the AI part, you need huge data centers to make the AI work. And those data centers, today at least, consume a lot of energy. And Mexico has an energy shortage. Very little investment. There was a big change in energy rules under AMLO, which effectively closed out the private investors. So, there was a story in a newspaper called Rest of the World by Daniela Dib about how Microsoft's data center, which already have a big one in Querétaro, kind of ran out of energy, and they had to put their own little generator next to their data center to keep the data center running, which is very costly and inefficient. So energy is a constraint. Now, Mexico is next to the United States, has free trade, has free capital markets. So if the United States kind of booms, as some people think will happen because of AI, there's a sort of another productivity leap and a lot of investment going into fueling AI. And there's going to be a lot of kind of secondary positive effects on Mexico, its neighboring country. And there's still a lot of activity that can't be done by robots or AI, agriculture, and so on. And if agriculture in California, is mostly done by Mexicans, and if they're not allowed to come to the US anymore, and no more if they're being kind of expelled from the US, well, you're going to have to do that. The food is going to have to be produced in Mexico for the most part, where the climate is pretty good for food. So if the US closes its border to migration, it's going to be a tremendous shortage of manual labor in lots of sectors. And so that manual labor, instead of crossing the border, will just do that work in Mexico. And I'm seeing that. I mean, you're absolutely in services where Mexico's become quite effective at kind of low tech work for US companies. And the companies like KPMG or HSBC have a lot of kind of cost centers in Mexico for their US businesses. Capital One, which doesn't have any business in Mexico, I think it's the largest credit card company in the world, has just opened a big tech hub in Mexico. And getting Mexican engineers. These aren't PhDs from MIT or Cornell. This is relatively low tech level. And with the whole H-1B visa fee of $100,000, Mexico is saying, well, just come here or use our existing engineers. Because about 50 to 60% of these H-1B visa holders are also doing relatively low tech work, sort of IT help, working for Indian-owned outsourcing companies. So, Mexico could benefit from all of this, but they do need to invest in establishing a decent legal system. I'm not personally convinced that this judicial reform is going to do it. It may make things worse. They need to invest, obviously, in public safety. They need to invest more in education. They need more competition. Mexico historically has had a very oligopolistic business sector. So a lot of things that Mexico needs to do, but so do every other country in the world needs to do these type of things.
Yeah. Scheinbaum is a energy economist, I believe, an energy engineer, right?
That's right.
Is she going to take Mexico into alternative energy? There seems to be huge potential, and right across the border in Texas, she can just follow that example. They have enormous success with wind and solar in Texas.
No, she wants to do that. Absolutely. She's a big fan of renewable energy. And it's a bit more expensive per kilowatt generated on average than fossil fuel, especially natural gas, because of the shale revolution in Texas. That gas comes to Mexico, and it's pretty cheap for Mexico. And Mexico's, for the most part, built some good pipelines to access that gas.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the government doesn't have a lot of money, so a lot of that renewable investment is going to have to come from the private sector. So I think people are quite encouraged by the new energy minister and the sounds that are coming from her administration. Hopeful that there will be, more investment in renewables. But after what happened under AMLO, and there were a lot of rule changes that hurt renewables and mainly private investment, people are a bit shy right now about plonking billions of dollars into a wind farm or into a solar farm when they lost hats 6 years ago. So there needs to be needs to be a little bit of time to pass, maybe some new contracts and rules that can help mitigate fears that people have. But for sure, she wants to go there.
Damian, final thoughts on: is there any hope for the Mexican stock market, the BMV? We've seen more delistings and IPOs. Not that every stock market in the world is booming, but emerging markets have done well. Mexico, some of the stock, but I mean, is from an investment standpoint, like, is there any hope for the BMV to sort of, or just Mexican investment in general from the public market standpoint to have any, because it seems to be they're just kind of fading.
Yeah, I mean, there are two stock exchanges, as you know, BMV and Beaver. I think Beaver's actually had a bigger share of new listings than BMV recently, but there have been very few new listings, as you said. I mean, the market is doing very well right now. It's up 35% or so this year, outperformed the US. But it's become more and more narrow as a relative to GDP due to these delistings. I mean, I think there's always hope, and I certainly am not going to give up. Having spent quite a big part of my professional life looking at the Mexican stock market, but so much of I'll give you one example. So much of the GDP comes from these global companies that are listed in the US. You know, advertising in Mexico used to be dominated by Televisa. It was this big company. It was worth, $20-30 billion. Now it's worth like $3 billion. What happened? Almost all of that advertising revenues went to Meta through Instagram, went to Google through YouTube or Google Ads.
Yeah.
And then the viewership went to Netflix and the others. So it was a kind of perfect storm. Maybe they made some mistakes along the way, but
no, the same thing happened in Brazil. Exactly, they destroyed the media industry.
So you see this kind of this value added, this GDP, just like move from Mexico to the US, in the sense that all the profits after taxes have gone to these US companies, and they're globally scalable. They're in 150 countries or so. So pretty tough to compete with that. And AI is probably going to make that worse, or at least accentuate that, because no one else really. Maybe one, I think there's Minstrel, one French company, but basically all the big foundational models are American. So if there's value acquired from AI, a lot of it will go to the US. But then in Mexico, because it's next to the US, because you had free trade and more or less free investment, except for energy, it was very easy for American companies or Spanish companies to come to Mexico. Big country, 130 million people. So if you look at retailing, by far the biggest retailer, double the size of the next one, is Walmart, American company. If you look at banking, BBVA makes about half its global profits in Mexico, but it makes or more. It makes about $6 billion a year in Mexico. That's probably 40% of total banking profits in Mexico are made by one Spanish bank. And then in the top three, you have Santander as well, which is obviously Spanish. So Mexico, because it's kind of a victim of its openness to investment and trade, that so much of these gains, BBVA is not listed in Mexico, nor is Santander anymore.
Is Banamex going to relist?
Say that again?
Is Banamex going to relist?
Yeah, that's the plan. And that would be a good news. But so, because if you go to the UK, where I'm from, you also read about the London stock market kind of becoming irrelevant. It's kind of the same thing, just the profits are there, they're just not going to companies listed in London. And then you get higher valuations in the US if people want to move there anyway. So yeah, the only sort of big successful sort of IPO out of Mexico over the last 5 years that I can recall is Tiendas 3B, the hard discounter, kind of modeled after Addy and Lidl and so on, Trader Joe's. And guess where they listed? In New York. They didn't list in Mexico. It's been a huge success, but not a success that will benefit the local exchanges. So the Banamex will be an exception. Hopefully things will change. But it's challenging in this globalized world to compete with the US markets.
Damian, thank you so much, buddy. This has been amazing. I think we've touched on all the important parts, and really appreciate your insights and joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Damian. And I recommend anybody interested in Mexico to follow Damian's podcast.
Yeah.
Which you do on a weekly basis, right?
That's right. MexMoves, as I mentioned. Well, thank you, Tom and John. It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast, and I hope we can do it again at some point.
Thanks, Damian.